Okay.
Okay. All right. Shir will not focus this week on the Seder of the week, but I would like to discuss about Yom Hashoah. This week, tonight, many will have meetings commemorating Yom Hashoah, the day that many remember the Churban of Europe, the destruction of the Jewish communities in Europe. And there has been a lot of controversy surrounding this observance. Now, remember, many years ago, it was after we moved to Chicago, my father was invited to give a share to one of the student groups in Brooklyn College. And it had to do with Yom HaShoah. It was actually on Yom HaShoah. And my father, at that time, spoke about two mitzvahs of Kiddush Hashem. One mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem is the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, of dying because of commitment or dedication to the Torah. But then there is another mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, and that is being killed in the name of Klal Yisrael, in the name of the Jewish people. And both are mitzvahs of Kiddush Hashem, my father said, because Kishmenu Karasa B'Shmecha, the name of the Jewish people is identified with the name of God. And those who try to kill the Jewish people, when they do so, the Jews that they killed are considered to have died in Kiddush Hashem. And my father mentioned about the Crusades, where the Jews were told that they had to convert, to change their religion, to give up the Masorah. And they obstinately, in a positive sense, of course, refused to succumb to the demands of the soldiers of the Crusades. And that was what my father would call direct Kiddush Hashem. But in contrast, there were Jews who were killed because of their commitment to the Jewish people, because of their identification with the Jewish people. And that is Kiddush Hashem of Kishmenu Karasa B'Shmecha, who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and were killed in the rebellion against the Nazi beasts. We're also fulfilling the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. Because Kibishmeinu Karasa B'Shmecha, our name, the name of the Jewish people, is identified with the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And at that time, I remember shortly after my father's shir, I was talking to my mother, and my mother mentioned, she had attended this shir also, that Rebbetzin David, Rav Hutner's daughter, who passed away a short while ago, one of the outstanding Mechanchos of the generation. She attended that year, and she was writing over notes as my father was delivering this year. Now, my father had a special relationship with Rav Hutner. When my father was 12 years old, so my grandfather went to New York to assume the position of the Meiche Te'ili, who had passed away a year before. And my uncles, my father's brothers, two brothers, were at that time in the university. One was my uncle, Rabbi the Rabbi, was in Berlin. My uncle, Shmuel, he was studying in France. And at that time, Rav Hutner had returned from Chevron Yeshiva. He returned 6 weeks before the Chevron massacre. And if my memory serves me correctly, this is what I think I heard from my father. And Rav Hutner, shortly after the shir, called my father. And my father, so for 1 year, Rav Hutner was my father's Rabbi. They learned Maseches Bava Kama that year until my father's bar mitzvah. In fact, my grandfather was in New York. He wasn't able to attend my father's bar mitzvah. And my father, Rav Hutner, told my father to make up his own Dvar Torah. As Rav Hutner later told my father and told my brother, I heard it from my brother, that he was scared that the people at the shul in Warsaw would think that my father took the piece of Torah from somewhere else. And because of that, he went around the shul telling everybody, das ist ein eigener. That's his own Chiddush Torah. Shortly before my father left for America, he went to visit his uncle in Brisk, the Brisker Rav, and the Brisker Rav actually sat down with him for many hours, talking and learning with him in Bava Kama. That was the Masechta, as I mentioned, that my father had just learned with Rav Hutner. And my father repeated the bar mitzvah drasha that he said and that he made up himself. And the Brisker Rav said to him, the Zayda, Reb Chaim, said the same thing in Volozhin when he gave his shir. And it's interesting that when my father finally arrived in America, got off the boat, and my grandfather met him, so my grandfather asked him to repeat his bar mitzvah drasha. And my grandfather replied in the exact same words as his brother, the Brisker Rav. So, but in any case, so my father was a Talmud of Rav Hutner for 1 year, from the age of 12 to 13. But nevertheless, even though it was for only 1 year, and even though it was at a young age, from 12 to 13, my father always considered Rav Hutner a Rebbe, one of his Rebbeim. And my father did not have many Rabbi. And even though over the years, their views, their attitudes on different issues that faced Klal Yisrael was not exactly the same. Matter of fact, I would say over time, their opinions became increasingly different on these issues. Nevertheless, they had the greatest respect one for the other. And my father always considered Rav Hutner as one of his rebbeim. And when Rav Hutner was taken as a hostage by the Palestinians, my father, I can be made, my father couldn't sleep at nights. He was constantly making telephone calls all over the world, trying to get people to apply all kinds of pressure. And at that time, Rav Hutner, when he called up my father, so he said to my father that he heard, we obviously knew how, exactly what my father said in the shir. And he said to my father, it was an excellent shir. It could have been said any day of the year. But his feeling was that it should not have been said on that day, on Yom Hashoah. And he said, just because those people, meaning in the Knesset, decided on that particular day, so that, therefore, that day has significance. And he said to my father, he even said, the shir that my father gave, he said Reb Chaim could have given that shir. But he said Reb Chaim would not have given it on that day. Many things happened in the world between the time, Reb Chaim's time, and the time my father gave that shir. But, and he said to my father that my father should not let himself be used by others. Now, my father was identified with the aspiration of the Jewish people returning to Israel, returning to Eretz Yisrael, with the reestablishment of the state of Israel. But my father, by nature, was never really part of a movement. When one is part of a movement, he loses individuality. We see many of the so-called liberals today, even those who identify themselves as Jews who support the Jewish people, but because they're part of a movement, they became part of an alliance that is against the Jewish people, against the Jewish nation. It's an alliance that wants a situation to continue that endangers the lives of the Jewish people, that will permit murderers and rapists at will to attack at any time, to kill thousands of Jews. And while all these people understand that what's and a similar type of attack happens against the United States, those who harbor the leaders of those attacks, if they don't give them over, they bear responsibility. Afghanistan, because they wouldn't give Osama bin Laden over. That was justification for the United States to go in. But all the Arab countries and communities that harbor the leaders of Hamas, and it's not just one place, they're treated as mediators, identified as people of peace. Look at the hypocrisy of the world. Do not believe that they are our friends, but because the movement wants to include many of these people, so even some of the Jews are ready to risk the lives of the Jewish people, the continued lives of the Jewish people, the ability to the Jewish people to live in peace and tranquility. So, and because people who are part of a movement, they give up their individuality. And while my father was devoted, my father never gave up his individuality. And he would call out against those who he was associated when he felt that they were wrong. And that was probably Rav Hutner's concern. Now, and then Rav Hutner said another thing. He said, even Menachem Begin felt, and my father certainly wasn't in disagreement with that the proper time to commemorate Yom HaShoah would be on Tisha B'Av. So his first argument was we shouldn't accept what the Knesset declared. And to be honest, it's not important from my perspective that the Knesset declared that day as Yom HaShoah. What is important is that the Jewish people, the masses of the Jewish people, I'm not saying every Jew, but certainly at that time, the masses of the Jewish people in the state of Israel, they recognized that day. For them, it was a day of commemoration. And that in itself, it's not what Ben Gurion said or what some other politicians said that gave that day any special significance. It's the fact that Klal Yisrael, that the Jewish people used that day to focus on the Shoah. But I think Rav Hutner had something else in mind. And I'm digressing. I'll talk from a halachic perspective a little bit later in the share. But I think When you take a look at the beginning of the Roman conquest of Jerusalem, of Eretz Yisrael, initially there was a more positive attitude towards the Chachamim. Not that there weren't those that were killed, there was. But Tenli Yavne v'Chachameha, the Romans initially did not feel so threatened by the Lomdei Torah, by those who were sitting and learning, those who were sitting and teaching. They felt threatened by those who had official positions of leadership. They saw them as a threat as to who will be the leaders of the Jewish people. But the Chachamim, they were religious teachers. They didn't represent in their minds at that point yet such a great threat. But later on, and to a certain degree, that's a large part of what the Asura Huruge Malchus is about. They began to recognize that in the absence of official Jewish leadership positions, the Chachamim, the teachers of Torah, became, if not the official leaders of the Jewish people, more dangerously, the unofficial leaders of the Jewish people. And to a certain degree, with the rise of the Zionistic movement, that position of leadership became threatened. And it wasn't just Zionism, all kinds of movements that were taking place at that time. And the Rav of the town was not necessarily any longer regarded as the leader of the Jewish people in that town. And perhaps, I don't know, had religious leaders earlier taken a stronger stand in terms of encouraging the Jewish people to go to Eretz Yisrael, to leave the European community, perhaps that situation would have been different. Anybody could suggest, but in truth, nobody knows. And I think that perhaps part of the opposition to recognition of what the Knesset did was perhaps because they didn't want them identified as the leaders of the Jewish people. But as I mentioned, when it comes to these type of questions, it's not to be viewed just from the perspective of what the Knesset said. When there's a law about traffic, about anything, any civilian matter, yes, they are the leaders. But when it comes to these type of things, I think we shouldn't view it from the perspective the Knesset decided about a particular day. It should be viewed from the perspective that the Jewish people recognize it, use that day to focus on certain things. And when we focus on those things, perhaps we will have a different perception than the others because of our background, because of our attitudes, but we're not doing it because of the Knesset. Now, I think another thing, and what is interesting is that I sensed, but this is only in recent years, that the opposition to giving special recognition to Yom HaShoah was greater than the opposition to Yom HaAtzmaut. Of course, those who are opposed to the state of Israel, they don't give special recognition to Yom HaAtzmaut. But I would have thought Yom HaAtzmaut, that has to do with the establishment of a government that they considered non-observant, they considered anti-Torah. That would have been what they were most concerned about. But much to my surprise, they were more upset, at least in my dealings with individuals associated with recognition of Yom HaShoah. And I think the reason perhaps for it is because they don't want the political leaders to identify with what they consider the past glory of the Jewish people. And there is this perception, of course, in the later years, it's not the way they would like to believe, but there is a perception that in Europe, religious life permeated the town, permeated the cities, permeated the Jewish communities. Certainly more than it is in America. And they did not want those who they considered to be secular Zionistic leaders to identify with the past. And perhaps had Gedolei Yisrael sensed the need to establish a day, apparently there was a drive, a need in the Jews to have a special day, to cry out, to focus, not to ignore what happened. And I think there is, and the reason that was given was because the reason given, I think, was because is because we wanted it associated with Tisha B'Av. We wanted that all the events of anti-Semitism that took place since the Churban should only be identified with Tisha B'Av. And they went so far and this is based, and I should add that my uncle, who certainly was identified with I'll call it the religious Zionist cause, he also was in the opposition to recognizing Yom HaShoah as the day of focusing on the Holocaust. And at one point, when Ben Gurion came to America, from time to time, he would meet with my uncle. And in one of those meetings, he raised the question as to why my uncle was opposed to Yom HaShoah. And my uncle said to him, and the same argument was mentioned by my father's uncle, the Brisker Rav, who was opposed to the Zionist movement. He says when there is a kinnah on Tisha B'Av, and the kinnah on Tisha B'Av, mi yitain roshi mayim, it talks about three cities, but it wasn't just these three cities. In the First Crusade, when the soldiers of Europe were responding to the call of the Pope to go liberate, in his words, Jerusalem from the infidels, from the Arabs. So at that time, on their way to Jerusalem, they considered it their holy task to kill and destroy the Jewish communities that were on the way. And this kinnah talks about three major towns, three major cities, where the Jewish community was wiped out by the soldiers of the First Crusade. And it says there, at the end, Simuna alavavtem mispeid mar lekashra. Please take to your heart to compose a bitter eulogy. Kishkula harigosam lehisapel. And by the way, this happened in the Shavuos period of time. Kishkula harigosam lehisapel lesafra. Because their massacre is deserving of mourning and rolling in dust, as was the burning of the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God, its hall and its palace. V'chi ein lahosif moed sheber b'savera. So the way it's translated, nor may we, however, we cannot add a new day of mourning over ruin and conflagration, nor may we mourn any earlier, only later. And we can't do it earlier, we have to push it later. Instead, today on Tisha B'Av, I will arouse my sorrowful wailing. And they understand the kinnah. The kinnah is saying, I can't create a new day to mourn the tragedy. So in place of making another day, it should be on Tisha B'Av. And they understood that the Baal HaKinnah, the author of this kinnah, Rabbeinu Kolonimus, was saying that we cannot take another day to mourn the tragedies of Golus. It can only be on Tisha B'Av. And yes, the Jewish communities were murdered, destroyed, plundered, massacred. Throughout the generations. But no special day could be set up for it. It has to be all on Tisha B'Av to show that Tisha B'Av is not just about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the destruction of the temple, but it's about the whole Golus, the whole exile period. To associate all these tragedies with the Churban, with the destruction, with the Golus. Now, to be honest, I don't know that they are necessarily translating it correctly. Now, we all know that many of the survivors of different towns during World War II, yeshiva towns, they have special days that are dedicated to focusing on the destruction of those towns, on the murder of the Rosh Yeshivas, of the Rabbanim of those towns. But and that's for those people in that town. But here we're talking about a fast day that a day of mourning for, if not for all of Jewry, certainly for all of Ashkenazic Jewry during the time of the Crusades. Now, my uncle, and he felt that Rabbeinu Kalonimus was of the opinion that you can't make another day. But his feeling was that Rabbeinu Tam disagreed with Rabbeinu Kalonimus because there was an incident that took place in one of the French cities where a Jew observed a non-Jew taking the body of a young non-Jewish child and throwing it into the river. And it was a non-Jewish child who the non-Jew had just killed. And the non-Jew murderer was aware that he was observed. So he quickly spread the word, told the authorities that the Jews of the town had murdered a non-Jewish child. It was the beginning of the blood libels. And because of that, the Jews, 30 some odd Jews of that town, I think 38, whatever it was, 35 Jews of that town, some of them the leaders of the town, the outstanding Talmidei Chachamim of the town, were burnt at the stake, alive. And what is interesting, I read that as they were being burnt at the stake, as the smoke of the fire was killing them, the way the story goes, their bodies were complete, almost like the Shnei B'nai Aaron. can't tell you about the details. They sang the Aleinu L'Shabeach. And it's very interesting. I was told that the Jews of Kelm, when they were taken by the Nazis to be killed, they sang a number of songs also. Ma Yofi Yerushaseinu, Ma Yofa Goraleinu. And they also, as they were being killed, sang, I was told, the Aleinu L'Shabeach. I find it interesting that somehow it became this yeshivish, and I'm not a singer. I don't sing the Aleinu. But I don't get upset if the Aleinu is sung. And for some reason, there are those who believe that to sing the Aleinu is unyeshivish. It's unbecoming of B'nai Torah. I'm not telling anybody to sing it, but I will tell people that it's a chutzpah to tell people not to sing it. It's grounded in arrogance and in stupidity, especially in view of the people, in fact, that this prayer, which is part of the Rosh Hashanah davening, was sung, or even reported to be sung, by those who are on a much higher level than any of these people when they were dying of Kiddush Hashem. But in any case, so Rabbeinu Tam and declared a fast day of Chav Siva to commemorate the many Jews that were killed. 38 some Jews were killed. 30 some, I forgot the exact number, were killed, burnt at the stake, because they died in direct Kiddush Hashem. They refused to give up their religion that was demanded of them. And because of that, Rabbi Ben Tam declared a special fast day on the date that the Chav Sivan. This is when this happened. And it's interesting, and it did not last too long. Even though Rabbeinu Tam, they say, predicted that it'll be accepted as a fast day, more so than eventually than Tzom Gedalia. Nevertheless, it didn't turn out that way. And my uncle felt that that was a simon. It was indicative that Klal Yisrael followed the shita of Rabbeinu Kalanimus. And Rabbeinu Tam had a different opinion, but Rabbeinu Tam's opinion was not the accepted opinion. However, my uncle was also troubled somewhat by Rabbeinu Tam's opinion. If they didn't declare a fast day for the first crusade, when so many more Jews died? Why did he declare a fast day for the Bnei Ashkenaz? Because of what happened in one particular town. Many less Jews were killed. Of course, every Jew is an olam mole, is a whole world in itself. But the inconsistency, the seeming inconsistency troubled my uncle. And he said he doesn't understand. Didn't Chas v'Shalom say anything more than that. But he said he didn't understand. And also, I was somewhat troubled. The Crusades, they traveled over Europe. Every town that they went through, the Jewish community suffered at their hands. This was one town that wasn't, unfortunately, throughout Jewish history. That wasn't so unusual. How many pogroms? Read the history book of each town. They all had pogroms. And perhaps to a certain degree, because they didn't understand how history moves quickly and changes. There was an attitude during World War II. We survived the pogroms. We will survive this also. It was a mistake. And I think Rabbeinu Tam didn't make a mistake. Rabbeinu Tam understood that there are certain things that catch like wildfire. There are certain episodes, certain incidents that it happens in one town today, it's going to happen in another town tomorrow, and in a third town the third day. Aliyah Saddam, the blood libels, plagued the Jewish people throughout their history in Europe. And this was the beginning of the blood libels. It wasn't Rabbeinu Tam, in his wisdom, understood. It wasn't just this one town. It wasn't just this one day. And in the time of Khomensky, some say, killed 500,000 Jews in a short period of time. Many more than were killed during all the Crusades. So the Magen Avraham brings down the Tosfos Yontif. They also, because of an incident that happened on Chav Sivan, they declared Chav Sivan again as a fast day, as a day of mourning. And what's interesting, and many write that they don't know the reason for it, they declared that those who are men who are at the age of 18 and women at the age of 15 and above should fast. They didn't say 13 and 12. Everybody is troubled. Why? I think I saw in one source 17 and 14 a year earlier, whatever it is. And there were some individuals that observed this fast day. And to a certain degree, they used the pattern of Ne'ilah, the Slichos of Ne'ilah, for the number of Slichos that should be said on these fast days. For some reason, they wanted to identify it with Ne'ilah of Yom HaKippurim. and Chav Sivan. But also it was incidents that happened. But again, even though so many Goli Israel mention it, Poskim mention it, my uncle writes the Marsha was against it. But many Goli Israel, especially the Tosfos Yontif, the Magen Avraham mentions it. I think they bring down the name of the Shach also. Nevertheless, after a couple of years, only individuals observed that day at morning. But I think that there is no machlokas. There is no dispute between Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbeinu Kalanimus. There is no question that ideally we should recognize these sorrows as part of the Churban. But Rabbeinu Tam understood that when you'll have the invading armies on their way to Jerusalem, going through each town, it will be seen as a national tragedy. And a national tragedy, people at that time, the bulk of the Jewish community were Yirei Hashem. You see how few submitted to the demands of the Crusades to give up their religion. They will associate it with the Churban, with the exile. They will recognize that what happened with the Crusades is part of the exile. But when an incident takes place in one town, and these people will not have the foresight that Rabbeinu Tam had to recognize how this will go from town to town to town. So they will not see it. They will not recognize the tragedy. They will not recognize the threat. They will not recognize the tzara. They will not recognize their need for Rachmei Shamayim if they were in another town. And unfortunately, even during World War II, when you talk to any survivor, it was always somewhere else until it reached their town. So Rabbeinu Tam felt there was a special need to have a specific day. And as a result of recognizing the danger, the people would understand, come to recognize eventually the impact, the effect that Golus had on them. But Rabbeinu Tam, he felt that if we give it over just to Tisha B'Av and don't give it a special day in itself, it will be the meaning of this incident will not have the same effect on the people of his time and in that situation. And during World War II, times changed. People were not as committed and understanding of Golus, what Golus was. And because of that, there probably was a special need to have a Yom HaShoah. And let me tell you, I'm 74 years old. I'll soon be 75 years old. I was born shortly after World War II. Many of my friends, I lived in New York, were the children of second marriages. Their parents, who were survivors, had lost their first families, lost their spouses, lost their parents, lost their siblings. If you came in, and I mentioned this over and over, if you came in when Yisker was being said, the crying that took place, people practically had to be carried out of the shul. And this was on Yom Tov. Imagine what's going to happen next year, Simchas Torah, in Eretz Yisrael, with the thousands of Jews who were killed. When the Jews will say, Yisker, at the completion of the holiday of Sukkot. And this is what we saw as children. You know, a certain Rosh Yeshiva, one of the leaders of the Frum community in the United States, was once speaking in Chicago. And he said that when he sees a European Jew, Tisha B'Av, he sees them crying. He says he doesn't have that ability. Of course he doesn't have that ability. He wasn't like the frauds, the fakers that make believe that they're crying. Because he lived in security in the United States. He didn't have to worry about anything. It's interesting. My cousin, Rabbi Soloveichik, he wrote in an article that he was brought up in Boston. And Yom Kippur at night, Yom Kippur in the day, there were many Jews in shul, European Jews, who weren't Shomer Shabbos. Yom Kippur, they came to shul. They cried in shul. He says, then he went to Eretz Yisrael, and he was learning he was learning in Eretz Yisrael. He said, in Eretz Yisrael, the young people were not crying. They were in frum communities. From communities. He didn't say which yeshiva that he was davening in, but in frum communities in Bnei Brak, he said. I just assumed something. But in the frum communities in Bnei Brak, and he didn't see the young people crying at all. He says the Jews in Europe, in their mind, they weren't Shomer Shabbos or anything. But they didn't have that sense of security. And in their mind, they were trained as youngsters. Yom Kippur decides everything. Yeah, Mechal Shabbos. But if I beg HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he'll show Rachman to me. But those who live in security don't have that feeling. And perhaps the message we're getting is there's a false sense of security. A false sense of security in the United States. And a false sense of security in Eretz Yisrael also. In communities where people don't have to, their lives are not immediately at stake. who are not on the battlefield. And I'm not suggesting that they have to go on the battlefield, but I am suggesting that you should recognize the contribution of those who are going on the battlefield to fight not only for their lives, but to fight for your lives as well. There's a need for Torah and there's a need for soldiers, and both need each other. And so long as people will say, we don't need the soldiers, they'll ignore the 1929 massacre in Hebron. You can be sure that the soldiers will say, we don't need you either. Each one has to come to recognize the need for the other one. And until one recognizes the need for the other one, he can be sure that the other one won't recognize the need for him. So the Jewish people, after the Holocaust, were so far removed from the time of the Churban. Yes, ideally, we have to see it as the Churban took place now. In any generation that the Beis HaMikdash was not rebuilt, it was as if it was destroyed today. That's all true. But with that attitude, you're not going to get people to recognize Gullus. Listen, I was a boy. I said I'm 74 years old. I went to shul. I went to the most religious camps. And in those days, we said kinnis. And the head of the camp, who was a Rav, very fine, came from one of the outstanding Jewish families among the Jewish people. He would speak about each kinna. World War II was not mentioned once. Today it's different. Why? Because of the competition of Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah accomplished that today Tisha B'Av is devoted to the whole Golus. And we have to recognize today how insecure we are. Look what's happening all over the United States. Look what's happening in Eretz Yisrael. Thousands can get in at any moment. We have to learn from history. And today, unfortunately, most of the survivors are no longer here. World War II was on our minds. It wasn't presented to us. And perhaps, I'm not finding fault with anybody, perhaps they felt the survivors have to rebuild themselves. And to focus on what happened in World War II would interfere with that rebuilding purpose. But we need to remember. And we need to learn from what happened. What happened in Europe? What happened? And we know that even rabbis interfered with Jews trying to apply pressure to Washington. And we need to learn from the example that's happening today, where people who consider themselves the supporters of the Jewish people, even Jews, talk against Israel in a roundabout manner. They're only talking against Netanyahu. No. They want the Jewish vote, so they make believe it's only against Netanyahu. They're talking against the state of Israel. They're talking against Israel having this ability to continue to survive. The more there is a need for Yom HaShoah, because not every Jew is going to recognize Tisha B'Av. But the more Jews that come to recognize Yom HaShoah, the more they eventually will come to recognize Tisha B'Av. The Israel knows already, but before they bring someone to Israel to explain the Zionist cause, they take him to Poland, they take him to the concentration camps. to understand the need for a state of Israel, to understand the need for a state of Israel. It's difficult, it's going to be difficult for many individuals to come to recognize Golus by first looking at the Churban. But when you look at the incidents that are close to our time, instead of going from back forward, from the earlier time to the later time, there are Jews that have to go from the later time to the earlier time. They will come to recognize Tisha B'Av, but it's not going to start with the Churban. It has to start with what's taking place today. It has to start with the Holocaust. It has to start with the pogroms of Europe, what the Jewish people suffered. We said we can begin to understand history if we understand our own time first. But if we're not going to understand and we're not going to delve into what's happening in our time, those who have no background in the real history, I'm not talking the history of the books, but the experiential history that is given over through the Masorah, they're not going to be able to come to understand the whole thing of Holocaust. Judaism to them will be a religion just like any other religion. And we want them to come to become part of the Masorah. The only thing is they connect from the present to the past, whereas our Masorah goes from the past to the present. But ultimately, the Masorah is restored both ways. And that's the idea, I think, of Yom HaShoah. Everything is dependent upon the situation, and it depends what the situation demands. There is no machlokas, I don't believe, between Rabbeinu Kolonimus and Rabbeinu Tam. It all depends on the individual situation.
If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat.